Hi, it's Mark Bernard here with the Bernard Institute for Cybersecurity, and I'm here to be your instructor on this lesson today. It's lesson number 7 of 23, and we're going to be talking about identity and access management. The program is called the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and the course is the second module. It's called Protect. And again, we're going to be talking about identity management, authentication, and access control. PR.AC. Within the reference architecture, you can find this section right here. There's a number of controls that we're going to be going through. So you can see there's 6 different lessons in this one module. And this one is called Identity Management, Authentication, and Access Control. You can find this information up here too on the header throughout all of the slides within the program. Now we're going to take you from a very basic understanding and elevate that so that you actually understand what the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is doing. And then hopefully you'll be able to take some of this knowledge and apply it to your current job or perhaps a new job that you're thinking of applying for that does deal with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Once you've used this for a little while, months, maybe a few years, you're going to be able to troubleshoot problems with it. And finally, you'll be able to learn how to audit it. And of course, you can always redesign the program. Now the goals within this particular section are as follows. So identities and credentials are issued, managed, verified, revoked, and audited for authorized devices, users, and processes. So this requires identity and access management or an access management procedure to be written and put into place. Okay, physical access to assets is managed and protected. So the physical access, so that servers in our data centers might be restricted to only operations staff, for instance. Front office might be restricted to only front office people. Facilities might be dedicated to different functions. We might have warehouses and laboratories that have special authorizations, manufacturing facilities, and what have you. So physical access has to be managed along with logical access. And remote access is very important, especially in these days of pandemics. There are many different remote uses. We have salespeople who are always on the road, probably accessing the systems from remotely. We have executives who are, going from meeting to meeting inside the office and outside, accessing the system. And we may have service providers also getting remote access. And maybe support employees during holidays or during off business hours when there's a problem. The system might alert them and they might have to log in remotely in order to fix a problem. Goal number 4, access permissions are managed incorporating the principles of least privilege and separation of duties. So separation of duties is pretty simple. It means that we try not to give one person all the control over an entire process. For example, check writing. We might have some people doing the accounting part of the checks and printing the checks, but there's a separate person completely who does the signature. So there's always 1 or 2 people involved in the process. This reduces the chances of fraud and because collusion requires more than one person to be involved, and the statistics say that that's very unlikely in most organizations. So we try to include multiple people. Principles of least privilege. This simply means that you only get access to the data and the network services and the facilities that you need to do your job. So this is very important. It should be built into the job description. In fact, human resources should work with the hiring manager and make sure that the job descriptions meet what it is that the requirements are for access. Goal number 5, network integrity is protected, incorporating segregation where appropriate. So in a lot of networks, it's possible for us to separate where it is that for instance, we have payroll processing in one area. We only need the payroll department to have access to that area. We have a finance department. They may only need access for financial people, for accountants, right? And maybe we have an operations area, so we only need to have the operations people have access to those systems to make sure they're supported and running. So wherever we can, we try to separate and segregate the network. This builds layers and resilience into our operation, our security architecture. 6, identities are proved and bound to credentials and asserted in interactions. So when we have people, when we give them access to perform a job on the network for the business, wherever they go in that network, the system needs to be able to prove that they belong there. So first of all, we need to validate their credentials when they first get hired. We need to make sure that the person who we hired is the person who has the credentials. Maybe it's government issued ID that we use to verify with. And then we need to make sure that whatever the access control is that we give to them, maybe it's a token, maybe it's a user account, that it can be proved where they go in the organization within the the logical infrastructure and the physical infrastructure, and then a record can be created from that. 7, user devices and other assets are authenticated. So we have many different ways of making sure that the devices who are attaching to the network belong there, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. That also includes using things like single-factor authentication. And what it means by commensurate with the risk of the transaction is that if you recall back when we were doing the risk assessments, we said that the investment in the controls that we put in place to mitigate risk can never exceed the value of the asset. So we want to make sure that whatever the control is not excessive. And individual security and other privacy risks to the organization are addressed. So we're going to be talking about a lot of this as we go through. Certainly privacy, GDPR or FOIPA or PIPEDA. These are all privacy legislations. We used to have the Data Protection Act before we had GDPR in California. We have the Consumer Act, which protects the information of consumers online. And we're going to show you how to comply with these legislations. Require an information or a cybersecurity program like the one that we're building here through this program. And if you build the program, then we can map the compliance requirements into it and prove how we're following the law and complying with the law. Okay, let's start. Next, I created some questions to help take those goals for this lesson down a level and help us to understand them better. So what is the process to assign identities and access control credentials to employees, for instance? So it's a question that we need to ask. It's a question that we need to find answers to. So we're going to be talking about what the answers are. Number 2, how is physical access to assets managed? Number 3, how is remote access managed? Number 4, where will the principles of least privilege and separation of duties be applied? So how will we use those inside the organization? How can network integrity be protected by security zones or segregation? So we'll talk about that. 6, how are employee interactions validated and included in all interactions? And number 7, how are users, devices, and other assets authenticated? Okay, let's start with question number 1. What is the process to assign identities and credentials to assets? Well, first there's an initiation process. So when an employee joins the organization, human resources is usually the first person that they meet, the employee's manager as well. And the employee manager will request access to the operations team or the security office to grant this person access to, again, network services, data and information assets, and services or facilities that they need to do their job. Okay, the manager is ultimately responsible for their employees. Then execute. The access control administrator verifies the approval process. So they're going to look at the request, see who it comes from, see if that's actually who the employee reports to, and then they're going to go ahead and make some changes within their environment in order to make this work. Identification. The access control administrator edits the information so that it will validate the user's account. So we want to make sure that whatever the account is that they have, it kind of can be used to identify who they are. So you could give generic accounts away, but if you gave generic accounts or group accounts to people, then we wouldn't be able to track what people are making changes to. So that would be not very good for security and not very good for providing any level of assurance within the organization. So this process can be done manually by an existing privileged user or automated through single sign-on. So ideally, it would be nice to have single sign-on so that the user doesn't write down their passwords, because if they have one password to remember and one user account, chances of them writing it down are almost slim to none. But if they have to have multiple credentials to log into multiple systems, and there is no easy way to do that, what will happen is they'll start using the same password over and over again within the different areas, and that's not good. Okay, authentication. The information system uses various techniques to authenticate a user, such as a PIN, so some kind of a 4-digit code, two-factor authentication. Basically, it's something that you know and something that is known by the organization. So, for instance, if you have a user account, people know what that is probably, and then then you have a password that's private to you. So that's two-factor authentication. And also, you may go to log in. You may have to click on a button and get a text message sent to your phone. So you have two ways of verifying who it is that you are. Multi-factor authentication is when you use different layers of authentication. So you may have a user password and account, but then you might also have like a thumbprint scan or a retinal scan in order to double up on the authentication to make sure it absolutely is you. And then, of course, there's voice and biometrics, which are other areas that can be used to authenticate people. Authorization. The user account is granted access for services, network services, and systems and information databases following successful authentication. Number 1. What is the process to assign identities and credentials to assets? Well, what's the first step? Accountability. User accounts are audited and need to be validated and reconciled. Okay? The access control policy and access control standards can help enforce what it is that you want to do with access control. There's basically a life cycle. So you can see here there's initiate, execute, identify, authenticate, authorize, and accountability. So this is the process that we go through in order to make sure that credentials are validated and that they go through a proper channel and get signed off on and reviewed at different stages of the process. Question number 2. How is physical access to assets managed? During new employee induction, employees must read the acceptable use policy and sign agreement following the policy. The policy includes physical access to assets. So this is sometimes called an employment contract, and it should address information security requirements. Employee's job description addresses physical assets, including buildings. So where will this person be working? If part of their job is to provide support to multiple locations, then that needs to be considered and included in the access control process. Some assets like servers are not physically accessible, but logical access may be granted. So what we mean by that is that a server could be loaded in the cloud. At a data center that's maybe hundreds of miles, maybe thousands of miles from where they work. So the only access that they're going to get is through the network. They don't actually have physical access. Employee's manager approves the employee's access to physical assets, always. The employee's manager also oversees day-to-day policy compliance. So this is something that doesn't always happen, but managers need to be reminded through the cybersecurity communication plan that you're supposed to be reviewing, first of all, the access controls to make sure that they're appropriate for the job, and also removing anything if someone leaves the organization or moves on. And also, if people are violating acceptable use policy, the manager needs to have a talk to them and make sure that they understand that they have to follow the policy. Employees manager addresses any misuse of assets with the employee. So most cybersecurity programs have a progressive area disciplinary process. This is something that human resource takes care of. And this is, if we have a lot of violations from a particular employee, we may have to go through some PIP, they call it, performance improvement plan, or progressive disciplinary action. It's the same thing. Basically, we want to see some improvement. We want to see changes. We don't want to see security problems happening with employees. All right. The employee's manager is responsible for reclaiming assets during job changes. So if an employee goes from one department to another, they may be able to take their laptop and their smartphone with them because it doesn't matter. Or there may be some information sensitivity and classification between the different departments, requiring them to either purge the laptop or the device or get issued a new one. So that can happen. And of course, if somebody leaves the organization and they have company equipment, we need to make sure that we have it in our hands. Usually what human resource does is they'll say to the employee, they'll say, before you get your last payroll check, you need to hand in the devices. If you don't hand in the devices, then you don't get your payroll check. So usually most people hand it in right away because they don't want to delay them getting their funds. Okay. The access control policy and access control standards will address these requirements, all the requirements, yes. How is remote access managed? The employee's manager is responsible for granting remote access. Employees working remotely should receive special remote worker training, and covers a number of different areas. For instance, authentication, authorization, encryption of local storage, anti-malware, VPN connectivity. So in some cases, when we provide the training, we say, here's the security tools that have been implemented on your system. Don't disable them. Don't change them. Don't disable them. Okay. Physical security zone awareness, perimeter security, social engineering awareness, to know that when somebody's asking them questions, understand that it could be a social engineering attack. So they need to ask questions, right? And then, of course, telecom intercept awareness. The access control policy and standards will address these requirements. Okay, so there we go. We've given you a list to work with. From inside the company, all remote access is monitored for suspicious activities. The company's security appliances may block or disable a remote device attempting to perform unauthorized access. That makes sense, right? You don't want a remote device logging into your environment and executing some kind of control command and doing things in your environment without you knowing who they are, right? You have to be able to trust them. Number 4. Where will the principles of least privilege and separation of duties be applied? Least privilege is a technique. It's used to reduce unnecessary exposure. This technique is restricted to access to information, assets, and system resources. Resources are granted access to only those absolutely required to perform any of the jobs. So we try to limit the type of access that people get and match it up again with the job description to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what it is they're supposed to be doing. The employee can only see or access applications they are authorized to. The employee may use company systems but only see authorized fields. The employee may be restricted from executing a program or some other applications. So there may be application level separation. The employee may only have access to specific floors within the building. Maybe they're not allowed into IT. Maybe they have to call and meet IT people somewhere else in order to talk to them. Closely related requirement by the integrated control frameworks created for financial reporting of duties sought. This access control technique restricts the assigned responsibility to one person for the approval of processing accounts. So we need maybe two people, a backup and a primary, to do approvals. Okay. How can the network integrity be protected through the use of segregation? Well, segregation is used to limit access to critical networks. So segregation can be applied all across your organization. You can have a very complicated segregation of duties approach, but you need to somehow make sure that that it's going to work, that it fits with the letter of the law, that we have segregation of duties, for instance, and that these logical or security zones, sometimes they're called, are built logically and they make sense, right? So we don't want to stop people, legitimate people, from doing their job, because we'll hear all about that from the executive team. But at the same time, we also want to limit the access to data that may be highly sensitive to the organization. A server certificate could be used to authenticate a server to a client or server to server. Network access control is pretty important. Not all organizations have a NAC, but a NAC is really important to validate that the devices attaching to the network are the ones that belong there. Because sometimes people will try and log in with their own home device, and you might want to block them from doing that. Maybe they can use their own device and they have complete control over their environment. And some of those security risks that we talked about, maybe there's no issue at all, but we don't know unless we do a risk assessment. So at some point, I think if somebody wants access really bad, and it's beyond the scope of the policy and the procedures, then we need to write an exception maybe and have it signed off by a senior manager. So NACs are very useful. They implement policies across the controlling devices that attach, the authorized devices that attach to the network. A NAC can set policies, resources, role, device, location-based, and enforce security compliance with security and patch management policies, among other controls. So it becomes a really integrated program through this way. Okay, next question, 5. How can network integrity be protected by segregation of duties? Segregating departments that handle sensitive information, classified information, reduces the risk. And that's true. So security team could be segregated. Financial team should definitely be segregated. Like this. Here's an example. So you can see we have servers here. There's 2 security zones here. So these dotted lines are security zones. They're set up by the firewall. We don't want to leave the security zone exposed to the internet, because that would be just trouble for us. So it is behind the first layer, solid layer of the network, of the way the logical network is laid out. What are the steps used to validate identities and include them in interactions? Well, one step is two-factor authentication. We talked about that a little bit, okay? So it's something that you could use in your organization. The way it works requires an example. A code on your phone could be sent to you. So you could have, you could be working or trying to log in. It doesn't let you log in, but then it says enter a code. So you enter the code and it sends you an illustration or that maybe you verify. So you might get something like, you've probably seen this before, I'm not a robot. So it might show pictures and ask you questions about what you see. So do you see, for instance, stop signs or stop lights in the pictures? And they'll show you 6 pictures, and you click on each of them, and then you get authenticated, okay? It could be simply a code that's sent to you, a 6-digit code, and then you just go to your application when you log in and you enter the code, and then you're authenticated. So that's two-factor. So it's something you know, and it's your smartphone maybe. Multi-factor is a little bit different. So multi-factor actually uses probably a higher degree of technology. It might use a retina scan or a thumb scan, as you see, or a hand scan. It uses some kind of additional, so it's multi-factor authentication, so it's multiple ways of authenticating somebody that's being documented here and applied. Six, continued. What are the steps used to validate identities and include them in interactions? Well, verifying the employee standing in front of you is easy, but doing it remotely can be difficult. So you need some way to do that. So there needs to be some kind of a government ID maybe you can use to validate who it is that you are before they grant you access. A digital signature is a cryptographic hash used to authenticate someone's identity online. It can be used to sign or encrypt or decrypt material. Very useful. To do this, I've used many digital signatures. It's easy. You can buy a certificate. You can attach it to, for instance, your Outlook or your company email system. And every time you send an email, it attaches itself and it encrypts your email. Now the person on the other side needs to know how to decrypt it. So this is where something else comes in that we're going to talk about is public key infrastructure. So public key infrastructure is just like it sounds. It's public as in the public of your network. So people attached to your company, that is your public area, your public space. And you create keys and you assign them to different individuals so that you can authenticate them and then it can encrypt them with their own credentials. Also, a firewall can be used to help authenticate. Firewalls help create and establish the security zones. Now they're being used to also to look at the user accounts that are coming into the environment, track their behavior, and make sure that it's consistent with what their job is and what they do. Firewall can support various levels of authentication. Authentication is the basic definition, means a user is claiming to be someone. So we need to be able to prove that. Question number 7, continued. How are users' devices and other assets authenticated? Well, the network access control is one of the best ways to do this. So it will look at the devices that are trying to log in, and it will check their IPs and their machine codes to make sure that they are who's been authorized. So that means somewhere in the infrastructure, someone is keeping track of your device and the codes that are on it, the serial numbers, in order for them to be able to authenticate that device. And it looks like this. So we have a NAC, and the NAC requires a lot of work because the NAC is going to be used to authenticate user accounts, but also send data to the security administrator. This is a good example because it's so isolated. This is a bad example, the big one, because the way that they've gone about doing this is not correct. So we can't really remove what it is that they said until we do another audit and then basically clear it up. 7, again. How are users, devices, and other assets authenticated? A digital signature is a cryptographic hash can be used. I mentioned it before. You can attach it to your Gmail account, and when you log into things or respond to people, it automatically encrypts it. It's very handy. PKI infrastructure is an encryption technology used to authenticate users and devices. The processes involved are more trusted parties, digitally signed documents with this certificate, and also clarify any sort of cryptographic controls within within the organization, within the infrastructure that you're using. Identity and access management is another way that we can use to identify user accounts and be able to authenticate them. Identity and access management is a large system that keeps track of user accounts and passwords, as well as a whole host of other activities and information that can be useful to the cybersecurity program. Practice. Okay, so here's some practice things we want you to do. So what we've just done is we reviewed the 7 goals for identity management, authentication, and access control. And we've talked about some techniques and how you can deploy it, or what you need to look for when you're deploying it, or when you're implementing it, or when you're auditing it. Now we're going to talk about some practice items. So we'd like you to take some time and work on these items. Now, normally when I lead a workshop or a seminar, because we're all together, we go through this as a team within the meeting. But because you're working on this as a self-paced kind of learning exercise, what I want you to do is go through the process, and if you have any questions, certainly drop us an email and we'll answer them for you. So the first thing you need to do is create a list of user accounts by department and geography. Okay, so we need a complete list of everybody who has access to our networks. We also need to create topology. A new security architecture is required for cybersecurity. It's a WAN, and it's going to be large, and it's going to show where all the devices are and all the data centers that we are integrated with. Review applications and databases used by each department. So this is important. Some people go and they create what they call an application portfolio. And if you're not sure what that is, you can also drop me a note and ask me, and I'll show you. I have some examples. But basically, it's a list of applications and databases used by each department. Now, we do, if you remember in lesson number 1, we talked about asset management, and we do definitely recommend that you get like a configuration management database to manage the 6 top assets. So again, people, information, software, hardware, telecommunications, and facilities. And when we load those into the database, then we can start creating some records of questions or changes or modifications, and then we can report on that. So it's always good to have a CMDB, and in the CMDB you would list your software, your applications. Analyze current systems used to authenticate users and devices. So you might want to create what they call an access control architecture. And we have examples of how to do that too, if you're interested. But basically you want to show the different segregations or segmentation within your organization, and where a person may have to scan the card to be authenticated again, creating sort of a digital trail across your organization as they do their job. So we need to make sure that the systems can do this, they can authenticate the users, and that they can give them the appropriate access that they need to do whatever it is that they've been assigned to do. Make recommendations for senior management approval. So then you may come into a situation where you've done your risk assessment against identity and access management, and you've discovered some opportunities for improvement, or maybe some big gaps. Maybe you've discovered some risks. So that's the appropriate route. So you write up a report and you present it to the governance committee, and then they talk about it, ask questions, and then they make some decisions on what you're going to do with that. Okay, now we're going to do some questions. So you go take some time and go and do your assignment. Okay, we've reviewed all the goals for this section, the first section of Protect. And now we're going to ask some questions to see how much you remember. Okay, what is the process to assign identities and credentials to assets? Do you remember the steps or the different gates that we have to go through? First of all, we have to identify who the person is in front of us is actually the person who they say they are. Then we need to be able to authenticate that person, right? So we need to be able to validate them, maybe against some government ID. And then we need to talk about accountability. So this is something that there's really 2 audiences for this. So there's the hiring managers who are responsible for employees underneath them. So that's a different kind of discussion. And then there's a discussion with the general employees and contractors about their accountability for the process and who they're accountable to make sure that there's no, misassumptions or any sort of gaps in governance. And then we authorize them. So we might check to make sure that the manager who they report to is a person who signed the authorization, but it should be a signed authorization that human resources will keep, or maybe the identity and access management administrator would keep a record of who signed and who didn't. Okay, second question. How is physical access to assets managed? Well, the employee manager decides, of course. Human resource may help make that decision possible. If they have a job description and they're recruiting people and the hiring manager says, okay, we're picking that person, we want to hire them, then human resources kicks into gear, may issue some advanced requests to grant authority or access for the network or the systems or the environment in order to make sure that it gets dealt with. Job descriptions. I had talked about this many times. Job descriptions are usually not done very well, and they need to be documented and updated. They need to reflect what the requirements are for the employee when it comes to granting them access. What facilities will they be working out of or need access to? What systems? Do they need access to the enterprise resource planning system, or do they just need access to the general ledger system, or maybe it's just the operational systems that they need access to because they provide support? So that needs to be documented somewhere in a job description. And of course, access control policy helps to set boundaries. So that can be done in many ways. You could have Active Directory. I know I didn't mention that up until now, but Active Directory is a popular Microsoft way of dealing with authorities and breaking down access assignments and policies. You can also use a NAC to help guide people to make sure, first of all, their device is authenticated, and then to make sure that they have access to the areas that they need to have access to. Question number 3. How is remote access managed? Well, again, the manager decides, does the employee require remote access as part of their job? And it should be in the job description, right? They must use VPN. So there's probably a list of security controls or things that they need to be aware of. So you might want to provide some additional training to people who are doing teleworking or remote working. They must have anti-malware on the system because that helps to cut down on the risk. We know that 60%, we're going to talk about this a little bit, there's a 60-40 split. So 60% of all malware is known, 40% is not. And this has been proven through various honeypot projects where the latest and greatest, semantic McAfee, Malwarebytes, those type of antivirus systems have been installed on systems and then granted access to the internet to see who would come and try and hack into them. And we found many different techniques through the honeypot projects. These hackers are trying to exploit things that people don't know about. So 60% of all vulnerabilities or threats are known, and anti-malware will help address the 60%. Must attend remote worker training. Well, that's a really good idea. It's a good idea to sit down and say, you know what, if you're in a cafe, if you stop at Starbucks for a coffee in the morning and you want to do a little bit of work there while you're enjoying your coffee, be aware there's shoulder surfers, okay? And other people who might see your screen or see what you're working on. And technically that's an unauthorized disclosure. That's a breach of security. So you don't want to get into a situation where you're the cause of a breach of security, because there'll be lots of questions asked to your manager and maybe to the auditors as well. And of course the security office. All right, question number 4. Where will the principles of least privilege and separation of duties be applied? Well, Segregation of duties. Again, I talk about the process. When somebody has to control a process or administer a process from the first step to the last step till it's completed, might be okay. But if it's a process where, for instance, you're printing checks, you're typing and creating a check, printing it off, and then signing the check with some kind of automated system, right? That might be highly inappropriate. It depends on the size of your company, how big your financial team is, financial accountants are, and but it is not a good idea for sure. So it's frowned on. And as far as least privileges, we talked about this before. This is something where you only give people access to the information and network services and the systems and facilities that they need to have access to, and restrict everything else. So where do the principles of least privileges and segregation of duties get applied? Well, field level access may be restricted. So it's true. You might have a group of people who have access to the enterprise resource planning system, whether it's Oracle or SAP, BPIX or JD Edwards. There's a number of them out there. But perhaps within the application, you have people only working on certain parts of the ERP system. So maybe some people are working on human resources, maybe some are working on payroll, maybe some are working on finance. There may be different accesses, so there's some kind of segregation of duties there. So field level access control or restriction is one way of limiting the visibility of the data, which can be helpful. Segregation of duties is another area where this gets applied. And we talked about this, about separating people's roles. Access to physical floor plans may be restricted. Application usage may be restricted. And this is where you get separation of duties and least privilege. Before we had some of the systems we have today, which are more sophisticated, we used to create a login script. And a login script would get assigned to the user account. So as soon as the person logged into the screen, the login script would be executed, and it would grant them access to different network services and databases every time they log in. And then when they log out, it would remove the access. So login scripts are, useful. Some of them are still used. They're trying to streamline the process a little bit by having this built into some of the systems. Question number 5, how can network integrity be protected by network segregation? Well, limiting access to critical systems. So if you have, again, financial systems or general ledger or treasury systems, you might want to have additional layers of control around that, restricting access to only the people that need to have access to it. So limiting access to critical systems, server certificate, pardon me. So a server certificate is just like it sounds. So it's like a key or a piece of encryption code, like a fingerprint that gets loaded on the server. So every time a device attaches to it, it can validate that that's the right server that it's supposed to be connected to. So this is a good idea to do. Where else? Network access control. So network access control can help protect the integrity. It can list the devices that have been granted access to your environment, and then anybody else who tries to log in with a different device, it will reject them right away. And authenticate clients to servers. And we talked about the server-side certificate, and this is another way to make sure that access control is lined up. So we might have single sign-on, for instance, and the user has access to certain specific systems within the organization and data, and we've created a certificate that's been issued to those different areas, to those different systems, so that each system can authenticate them as they try to log in. What are the steps used to validate identities and include them in interactions? Well, multi-factor authentication, we talked about this. You can have a user password and account, and you may also require a thumb scan or a retinal scan or a hand scan So biometrics can be used. Two-factor authentication can be used. So this is where you log into a system, but before it grants you access, it says, click on this code to send yourself a code to your phone. So your phone has been registered inside the system, so you can't see it on the outside. So it trusts it. So what it'll do is it'll send a text message to your mobile phone, and then you'll be asked to enter that code, whatever it is, into the system and get access. Implement one-time passwords. So this is another type of a device. RSA tokens, they're one of the leaders in this area. This is where you log into a system, but it asks you for the one-time password. So you click a button and it gives you a password, and that password resets every minute. So every minute of the day, that password will reset. So what it means is that once you use the password correctly and you get access to the system, then you don't need to worry about the password expiring because it doesn't matter to you, right? You're already into the system. But it helps to streamline things too a little bit, provide an extra layer of security. One-time passwords, they're good. Just requires a little more effort in order to enter them and validate yourself before you get full access. Digital signatures are good. They help to, provide a fingerprint of who you are by you entering some data into a program, and it creates this hash, encrypted hash, that every time you log into a system, it checks the hash to see who you are and what you have access to. And of course, you can implement PKI. We talked about public key infrastructure, how useful it is to set it up. It may require some effort. I'm not going to kid you. It's not something you can just turn on and then walk away from. It's going to take several months to do it right, to map it out, to make sure that you have all the different zones figured out, and any additional encryption keys that you need are ready to be created. So it can authenticate you, and it can also be used to provide non-repudiation, which means that you also won't be able to deny things that are done with your key. So that's good, and also provide a level of encryption to make sure that whatever it is that you're sending gets encrypted. Question number 7. How are users' devices, and other assets authenticated? So we can use a NAC to do the authentication, or PKI. We've talked a lot about that. We can use digital signatures to help authenticate users, devices, and assets. And we can conduct critical path analysis to identify what's important from a succession plan, who needs to have access. Maybe some people need to have more access than others. It's quite possible. We use group profiles for that, and we use something called RBAC, role-based access control, which really ties that job description into the level of control that you need to do your job. And that's it. So far, we completed the Identify module, which is done, and now we're starting a brand new module, and we've just finished lesson number 7. So it's the first lesson. We have 5 more to go. These first 2 are pretty large. Protect is actually the largest from a control point perspective. So it's an important one to get through. It combines a lot of different ideas about information security into one section. And so I think you're going to enjoy this. Look forward to working with you in the next lesson. And thank you today, and have a great day.